President Cyril Ramaphosa has arrived in Bali, Indonesia for the annual G20 Leaders Summit, where he is expected to lead the charge to secure an African Union seat at the Economic Forum. Themed Recover Together, Recover Stronger, the gathering has already allowed for a high-level meeting between the presidents of the United States and China, with relations between the world's two largest economies at their lowest in decades, strained by issues from trade to Taiwan. Ahead of tomorrow's summit, the UN chief referred to the G20 as ground zero for bridging divisions and finding answers on issues from conflicts to climate change and the cost of living crisis.
The gathering of the world's leading developed and developing countries comes at a time of great peril amid slowing global growth, a food and energy crisis, and a climate emergency that has placed the planet on a dangerous trajectory.
Geopolitical divides are contributing to global insecurity, triggering new conflicts and making it increasingly difficult to end old ones. There is a growing risk that the global economy will be divided into two parts, led by the two biggest economies, the United States and China. A divided global economy with two different sets of rules, two dominant currencies, two internets, and two conflicting strategies on artificial intelligence would undermine the world's capacity to respond to the dramatic challenges we face. This decoupling must be avoided at all costs.
With the leaders of the United States and China seeking to set a tone of cooperation ahead of the summit's official start on Tuesday, agreeing to restore regular communication while jointly voicing opposition to the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
As you know, I'm committed to keeping the lines of communications open between you and me personally, but our governments across the board, because our two countries have so much that we have an opportunity to deal with. As the leaders of our two nations, we share responsibility, in my view, to show that China and the United States can manage our differences, prevent competition from becoming anything ever near conflict, and to find ways to work together on urgent global issues that require our mutual cooperation. And I believe this is critical for the sake of our two countries and the international community.
Views echoed by the Chinese leader as he lamented the current relationship as not being in the fundamental interests of both nations and the world.
The world has come to a crossroads. Where do we go from here? This is a question that is not only on our mind, but also in the minds of all countries. The world expects that China and the United States will properly handle the relationship. Our meeting has attracted the world's attention, so we need to work with all countries to bring more hope to world peace, greater confidence to global stability, and a strong impetus to common development.
The presidency says Ramaphosa, who leads the only African country with a seat at the G20, would also chair an engagement of the African Union and NEPAD on Africa's value proposition and priorities ahead of Tuesday's summit. Among the key issues is a push from the UN chief for G20 support of a climate solidarity pact that would make extra efforts in this decade to keep the world's 1.5-degree temperature rise alive, as efforts continue to engage wealthier countries and international financial institutions to provide the financial and technical assistance needed to help emerging economies accelerate their renewable energy transition. Antonio Guterres has also called for G20 economies to adopt a Sustainable Development Goals stimulus package that would offer governments of the Global South investments and liquidity in addition to debt relief and restructuring in order to help achieve the SDGs. Sherman Bricepies, SABC News, New York.
Right, for more on the outcome of the meeting between US President Joe Biden and China's leader Xi Jinping, we're joined now by Thembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogue. Thembisa, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So, the one China policy expected to loom large over the meeting. So, just talk to us through some of the copy that you're seeing about how that meeting panned out?
Well, it was a long meeting. I suppose most of it was dominated by translation, but 3 hours is quite a long time for two leaders to be meeting. And of course, what dominated the meeting was not only Ukraine, but mainly Taiwan, which is of interest to both China and the United States. China claiming the Taiwan as its own, and the United States actually agreeing because they do support that one China policy. But at the same time, the United States feel that if it loses Taiwan, it will lose all technology. So it was a meeting with a lot of mixed topics, but those two, I think, dominated the meeting. But it was also interesting that we saw pictures showing Joe Biden walking towards Xi Jinping, meaning that the meeting, even though we were not told, but the meeting was obviously organized by China, because Xi Jinping was already waiting for Joe Biden, who walked to a standing Xi Jinping waiting to welcome Joe Biden. So according to both sides, the meeting was cordial, and the two leaders discussed pertinent issues important to both nations and indeed to the world. So we'll have to see, I think, after tomorrow, when they issue that longer version of their statement on what was achieved during this meeting and what still needs to be discussed moving forward.
So, although cordial, there were some tough issues that were brought up in strong terms, and I'd like to quote some of it: coercive and increasingly aggressive actions towards Taiwan. This is what we're told was raised by Biden, including Beijing's non-market economic practices. So what would have been the reception to such tough talk? Because it's being said the pushback by China on certain issues that are seemed or deemed sensitive by the US was also to be expected.
Yeah, I think the first issue was, of course, the Chinese had to remind the United States of the visit of Nancy Pelosi, if you remember earlier this year, when Nancy Pelosi went to visit Taiwan. But the most important discussion in this meeting was indeed Taiwan. The United States vowing that they will never give up Taiwan in terms of its support because of Taiwan's strategic importance in terms of producing the computer chips. But at the same time, the Chinese government insists that China belongs to them. But I think the other thing that concerns the Chinese is that Joe Biden might not make it in the next elections in 2024 in the United States, where Xi Jinping is set to be the president of China for the next 5 years. So there is, again, that element of uncertainty between the two, particularly when it comes to long-term discussions on the future relations of both nations.
And how does that put the balance of power? And I'm going to raise the issue of the global order, because, as you mentioned, Russia was something that would have loomed large at this conversation, although the quote-unquote expected showdown between Biden and Putin did not happen. But China's position on this certainly would have impacted the outcome of discussions and possibly even going forward. And this is almost pitting the two, or not almost, pitting the two biggest economies against each other on a highly polarizing issue.
Yeah, I think, Russia, although Russia is important, but for the United States at the moment, Russia is actually maintained, given that, if you've noticed, that Ukrainians are making inroads in terms of recapturing certain cities, and Russia seems to be on the back foot, except, of course, that they insist on weaponizing the gas supply to Europe in terms of pushing forward their objectives and agenda. But other than that, the United States did not enter this meeting mainly to concentrate on Russia-Ukrainian issue. They entered mainly to deal with issues of trade between the two countries, but importantly, Taiwan. And as I've said, that both nations seem to be digging in their heels in terms of how they deal with Taiwan and the autonomy of Taiwan. The United States, vowing to protect Taiwan. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen to Joe Biden. If the political fortune turns against him, we might just see a different political head in the United States who might just be amicable to Chinese intentions in Taiwan. And of course, that will put Taiwan in a much more complicated position. So it's a difficult talk at the moment. But I think while Joe Biden is there, he will insist on the independence of Taiwan, notwithstanding, of course, that he also supports the one China policy. So he will insist on the independence and autonomy of Taiwan because of the technology that Taiwan continues to provide. But China is unlikely to give in on its right to incorporate Taiwan into the mainland.
All right. So just as a springboard in the type of posture we can expect in the negotiations between North and South, I thought it was somewhat interesting, the divergent COVID-19 rules or protocols to mask or not to mask. We saw some people mask, some people not. Is this likely to influence how some of these post-COVID economic recovery issues are framed?
Yeah, it's likely. I mean, China seems to have its own policy when it comes to how it deals with the post-COVID era. Well, post-COVID era outside China, because China is still dealing with its own COVID challenges, and they want to reach a point where there's zero COVID infections. But at the same time, while doing that, they're impacting on China's economy. But whether it's good or bad, some people are saying it's good that China continue to encourage their people to consume and spend within the country instead of spending outside the country. So these COVID rules that have remained in China, one, serve their economic benefit, but importantly, it also serves the plans of the government in terms of further control of the people while they're busy planning the post-COVID era and post-COVID politics. These restrictions are helping the government of China to further control and suppress the movement of Chinese. And I think when the dust settles, we'll see a different China after these COVID regulations have been relaxed.
And for Africa, what can it hope for?
Well, Africa is open for business, but China remains one of the major trading partners. But at the same time, given what's been happening in Ukraine and the ambitions of the expansionist program of Russia in Africa and the possibility of the expanding BRICS, United States is feeling a bit edgy in terms of hands-off approach that it has always had, at least after the intervention of China in the African economy. The Americans are now finding the need and the reason why they should reinvest politically, socially, and economically in Africa, given that China and Russia are making serious moves in terms of controlling the African socio-political infrastructure and also courting a lot of governments in terms of the expansionist idea that they have on BRICS and also on the ordinary alliances that the Russians and the Chinese have planned for the rest of Africa.